In the suffocating silence of the Afghan desert, Master Chief Jake Morrison's SEAL team lay frozen behind enemy lines, watching helplessly as Taliban forces closed in on a trapped school bus filled with children. No backup, no escape route, no hope. Then, cutting through the dawn like thunder, came the unmistakable roar of an A-10 Warthog. But instead of unleashing hell, the pilot did something that defied every rule of engagement. What happened next would haunt Morrison forever and change everything he believed about war, sacrifice, and the thin line between salvation and damnation. The sand felt like broken glass against Master Chief Jake Morrison's face as he pressed his body deeper into the shallow depression that barely qualified as cover. Through his scope, he watched the yellow school bus sitting motionless in the valley below, its faded paint job a cruel mockery of normalcy in this godforsaken corner of Afghanistan. "How many?" whispered Petty Officer First Class Danny Reeves, his voice barely audible over the comm. Morrison adjusted his position, ignoring the sharp rocks digging into his ribs. 12 kids, maybe 14. Driver's slumped over the wheel, looks like he took one to the head. Tangos? Morrison swept his rifle left, counting muzzle flashes and movement patterns. 40 plus. They've got the bus surrounded, but they're not moving in. They're waiting for something. Petty Officer Second Class Maria Santos crawled up beside them, her dark eyes reflecting the cold fury that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. Intel was wrong. This wasn't supposed to be a hot zone. Intel's always wrong, Morrison muttered, but his jaw tightened. The mission brief had been simple: reconnaissance on a suspected weapons cache. Nobody had mentioned a school bus full of children caught in what was rapidly becoming a massacre. The Taliban fighters below moved with the casual confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. They'd set up a perimeter around the bus, but Morrison could see their true objective. They were using the children as bait, waiting for coalition forces to stumble into their kill zone. "Chief, we got movement on the ridgeline," reported Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Chen from his overwatch position. "More tangos coming down from the north. Maybe 20 more. Morrison's mind raced through their options, each one worse than the last. His 4-man team was outnumbered 15-1, with no backup for at least 30 minutes. The children on that bus didn't have 30 minutes. A small face appeared in one of the bus windows. A girl, maybe 8 years old, her dark hair framing eyes wide with terror. Morrison had seen that look before, in Fallujah, in Mosul, in a dozen other places where war had come calling on innocence. It never got easier. "Chief?" Reeves's voice carried the weight of the question they all knew was coming. Morrison lowered his rifle and looked at his team. 3 of the best warriors he'd ever served with, people who'd followed him through hell without question. Now he was about to ask them to do it again. "We can't leave them," he said simply. Santos nodded without hesitation. "Rules of engagement? There are children down there. That's the only rule that matters." Chen's voice crackled over the radio. "Chief, I'm seeing something else. Looks like they're setting up an IED near the bus. Big one." Morrison's blood turned to ice. The Taliban weren't just using the children as bait. They were planning to blow them up along with any rescue force. His finger found the trigger of his rifle as he calculated angles and distances. 40 meters to the bus. No cover except for scattered rocks and the burned-out hull of an old Soviet tank. "Danny, you take the ridge with Chen. Santos, you're with me. We go in fast and hard, punch a hole through their line, and get those kids out." "And if we don't make it out?" Santos asked. Morrison met her eyes. "Then we make sure they do." The Taliban fighters below had grown restless. Morrison watched through his scope as their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and an AK-47 slung across his back, gestured toward the bus. 2 fighters moved toward the vehicle's door. "They're moving on the kids," Morrison whispered into his comm. "We go in 30 seconds. He was about to give the signal when a sound like rolling thunder split the morning air. The distinctive growl of twin turbofan engines echoed off the canyon walls, and Morrison looked up to see the angular silhouette of an A-10 Thunderbolt II banking hard to the south. "Warthog inbound," Chen reported. "Looks like the cavalry's here." Morrison felt a surge of hope. The A-10 was a tank killer, built around its massive GAU-8 cannon. One strafing run would turn the Taliban force below into pink mist and scattered. Metal. The children would be safe. The A-10 completed its turn and dove toward the valley, its nose pointing directly at the cluster of fighters surrounding the bus. Morrison could almost hear the pilot's finger tightening on the trigger, could visualize the devastating 30mm shells that would rain down like the wrath of God. But the aircraft didn't fire. Instead, it pulled up sharply, climbing back into the sky without loosing a single round. Morrison stared in disbelief as the A-10 banked left, then right, circling the valley like a bird of prey that had suddenly lost its appetite for killing. "What the hell?" Reeves breathed. The Taliban fighters below had scattered at the A-10's approach, diving for cover behind rocks and abandoned vehicles. But as the aircraft continued its strange dance overhead without attacking, they began to emerge, pointing and shouting. Their leader waved his rifle at the sky, his body language radiating contempt and growing confidence. Morrison keyed his radio. "Hawkeye 7-7, this is SEAL Team Bravo. We have 40-plus tangos surrounding a school bus with children. Request immediate close air support." Static filled his earpiece for several seconds before a voice responded, young, maybe mid-20s, with a slight southern drawl. "SEAL Team Bravo, this is Hawkeye 7-7. I see the situation down there, but I cannot engage. Repeat, I cannot engage." "Hawkeye, those are non-combatants on that bus. Children, we need you to clear those tangos now." Another pause. I can't get a clean shot. The hostiles are too close to the civilians." Morrison's jaw clenched. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon was accurate enough to thread a needle at 1,000 feet. Any pilot worth his wings could take out the Taliban fighters without touching the bus. "Hawkeye, we're going in on the ground. We need air cover." "Negative, SEAL Team Bravo. I cannot provide close air support at this time." The radio went dead. Morrison stared at the A-10 as it continued its lazy circles overhead, its pilot apparently content to watch while children died below. In 15 years of military service, he'd never encountered anything like it. Air support was sacrosanct. When ground, "Forces called for help," the sky answered. "Always." "Chief, what's the call?" Santos asked. Morrison looked down at the bus, where the little girl still pressed her face against the window, her small hand flat against the glass as if trying to reach through to safety. The Taliban fighters were regrouping, their confidence growing with each passing moment that the A-10 failed to attack. "We go in without air support," Morrison said. "Same plan, but we move faster and hit harder." "That's suicide," Reeves protested. 40 tangos with no backup? Those kids will die if we don't act. That's not acceptable." Santos checked her rifle and adjusted her gear. "I'm with you, Chief." Chen's voice came over the radio. "Movement on the bus. They're opening the door." Morrison raised his rifle and saw the Taliban leader approaching the bus, his weapon raised. Through the dirty windows, Morrison could see the children huddled together, their small faces etched with terror. "That's it," Morrison said. "We're going now." He was about to give the signal when something impossible happened. The A-10, still circling overhead, suddenly dove toward the valley floor. But instead of attacking the Taliban positions, it came in low and level, its landing gear extended as if preparing to touch down. Morrison watched in stunned silence as the aircraft descended to barely 50 feet above the desert floor, then leveled off and began flying in a straight line directly between the Taliban fighters and the school bus. The roar of its engines was deafening, kicking up massive clouds of sand and dust that obscured everything in the valley. "What is he doing?" Reeves shouted over the noise. The A-10 flew the length of the valley, then banked hard and came back, flying the same line in the opposite direction. As it passed, Morrison could see something trailing from beneath the aircraft, not weapons or flares, but what looked like a thin stream of white powder. "He's drawing a line," Santos said, her voice filled with wonder. "He's literally drawing a line in the sand." The A-10 made 3 more passes, each time depositing more of the white substance in a perfect line between the Taliban fighters and the bus. When it finally pulled up and resumed its circling pattern, a stark, white boundary stretched across the valley floor like a scar on the earth. For several seconds, everyone, Taliban and SEALs alike, stared at the impossible sight. Then the A-10's radio crackled to life again. "This is Hawkeye 77 to all parties on the ground," the pilot announced, his young voice now carrying a steel edge that hadn't been there before. "I have just marked a line of demarcation. Any hostile forces that cross that line toward the civilians will be engaged and destroyed. Any civilians who cross that line away from the hostiles will be under my protection. You have 60 seconds to make your choice." Morrison felt his mouth fall open. The pilot. Captain Sarah Viper Cross sat in the cramped cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, watching the amber desert landscape roll beneath her wings as she flew back toward Bagram Airfield. Her hands trembled slightly on the controls, not from fear of combat, but from the weight of what she'd just done. In 15 minutes of airtime, she'd thrown away a 12-year military career and violated every rule of engagement in the book, and she'd do it again in a heartbeat. The radio had been silent since Colonel Mitchell's terse order to return to base, but Sarah could feel the storm building ahead of her like a wall of thunderclouds. She'd known the risks when she'd made the decision to draw that line in the sand. What she hadn't anticipated was how right it would feel. "Hawkeye 77, this is Bagram Tower. You are cleared for immediate landing runway 03. Proceed. Directly to the command hangar upon touchdown. Acknowledge." Sarah keyed her mic. "Bagram Tower, Hawkeye 77 acknowledges. Runway 03, direct to command hangar." The tower controller's voice was professionally neutral, but Sarah caught the underlying tension. Word traveled fast in the military, especially when it involved an A-10 pilot going rogue in a combat zone. By the time she taxied to the hangar, half the base would know what she'd done. The other half would think she was crazy. Bagram Airfield spread out below her as she descended, a sprawling military city carved from the Afghan desert, complete with runways, warehouses, dining facilities, and enough firepower to level a small country. It had been her home for 8 months, but as Sarah lined up for her final approach, it felt more like a prison. The A-10 touched down with barely a bump, its rugged landing gear absorbing the impact with practiced ease. Sarah taxied toward the command hangar, her eyes scanning the tarmac for signs of what awaited her. She didn't have to look hard. 3 black SUVs were parked near the hangar entrance, and a cluster of uniformed figures stood in the shade, their body language radiating official displeasure. Sarah shut down the engines and ran through her post-flight checklist with automatic precision, her mind already shifting to the coming confrontation. She'd rehearsed this moment during the flight home, running through possible explanations and justifications, but none of them seemed adequate. How do you explain that sometimes the right thing to do is also the most dangerous? The cockpit canopy hissed open, and Sarah climbed down from her aircraft, her flight suit damp with sweat that had nothing to do with the desert heat. Ground crew immediately swarmed the A-10, but their usual chatter was subdued. Everyone knew something big was happening. "Captain Cross." The voice belonged to Colonel James Mitchell, the wing commander, a man whose silver hair and lined face spoke of 3 decades in military aviation. Sarah had always respected him, but the expression on his weathered features now was unreadable. "Sir." Sarah snapped to attention, her eyes focused straight ahead. "You're to come with me immediately. There are some people who want to talk to you." The people turned out to be a mixed group that made Sarah's stomach sink even further. Besides Colonel Mitchell, there was Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes from JAG. the Judge Advocate General's office, whose presence meant legal trouble. A man in civilian clothes who had to be CIA or some other intelligence agency. And most ominously, Brigadier General Patricia Hawthorne, the regional commander whose reputation for destroying careers was legendary. They walked in silence to a conference room in the command building, their footsteps echoing in the air-conditioned corridor. Sarah felt like a prisoner being led to execution, but she kept her spine straight and her eyes forward. Whatever came next, she'd face it with dignity. The conference room was sterile and windowless, dominated by a long table surrounded by uncomfortable chairs. General Hawthorne took the seat at the head of the table, her pale blue eyes fixing on Sarah with laser intensity. "Sit down, Captain," Hawthorne ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years commanding others. "We have a great deal to discuss." Sarah sat, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. In her experience, the best strategy in situations like this was to let the other side talk first. They'd reveal their cards, and she'd know what she was facing. "Captain Cross," General Hawthorne began, "at approximately 8:47 hours this morning, you were ordered to provide close air support to a SEAL reconnaissance team. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you failed to engage hostile forces that were threatening civilian casualties." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "I did engage, ma'am. I prevented hostile forces from harming 14 children." By drawing a line in the sand with agricultural lime, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes interjected, consulting a tablet. "Using an A-10 attack aircraft as a crop duster. Do you understand how that sounds, Captain?" "It sounds like I saved 14 lives, ma'am." General Hawthorne leaned forward, her expression growing darker. "What it sounds like, Captain, is that you violated direct orders, endangered your aircraft, and conducted unauthorized psychological warfare operations without command approval. What it sounds like is a court-martial." The civilian in the cheap suit spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight Boston accent. "Captain Cross, I'm Agent David Reeves, Defense Intelligence Agency. Can you explain your decision-making process during the engagement?" Sarah looked at him carefully. DIA involvement meant this was bigger than a simple rules of engagement violation. Someone higher up the food chain was interested in what had happened in that valley. "Sir, the situation on the ground was fluid. Standard close air support protocols would have resulted in civilian casualties. I made a tactical decision to neutralize the threat through alternative means." "Alternative means," Agent Reeves repeated. "You turned your attack aircraft into a psychological warfare platform. Where did you learn that technique?" "I didn't learn it anywhere, sir. I improvised based on the tactical situation." General Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "Captain, do you understand the precedent you've set? What happens when every pilot in theater decides to improvise their own rules of engagement?" "With respect, ma'am, every pilot in theater isn't facing a school bus full of children being used as human shields. That's not the point." Hawthorne slammed her palm on the table. "The point is that you violated the chain of command, ignored established protocols, and conducted an unauthorized military operation. You put your aircraft at risk. You put the mission at risk, and you put American lives at risk." Sarah felt her composure finally crack. "American lives? Ma'am, with all due respect, those were children. Innocent children who were about to be murdered by terrorists. If saving their lives put American interests at risk, then maybe we need to examine our priorities." The room fell silent. Sarah realized she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd essentially accused a general officer of valuing politics over human life. Her military career had just flatlined. Colonel Mitchell spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Captain Cross, the SEAL team leader filed a report praising your actions. He credited you with saving 14 civilian lives through innovative tactics. What do you say to that?" Sarah looked at her wing commander, trying to read the expression on his face. Was he throwing her a lifeline or setting her up for a bigger fall? "Sir, I say that I did my job. My job is to support ground forces and protect innocent life. That's what I did. Agent Reeves consulted his notes. Captain, during your radio communications with the hostile forces, you issued ultimatums and threats. That constitutes conducting diplomatic negotiations without authorization. Are you aware that such actions could be considered acts of war? Sir, I was conducting combat operations, not diplomacy. I gave the enemy a choice. Stay away from the civilians or die. That's not negotiation. That's warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes looked up from her tablet. Captain, your personnel file indicates you're scheduled to rotate back to the States in 3 weeks. You've been selected for promotion to major and assignment to the Air Force Academy as an instructor. Are you willing to throw all of that away for this? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. The Academy assignment was her dream job, a chance to shape the next generation of military aviators, to pass on hard-won experience to young pilots who would face their own impossible choices. It was everything she'd worked for during 12 years of service. Ma'am, I didn't throw anything away. I made a choice to save innocent lives. If that cost me my career, then so be it. General Hawthorne studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. Captain, let me be very clear about what's going to happen. You will be relieved of flight status pending a full investigation. You will be confined to quarters, except for official duties. And you will be given one chance, to provide a satisfactory explanation for your conduct that doesn't result in a general court-martial. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her, but she kept her voice steady. What kind of explanation would you consider satisfactory, ma'am? The kind that acknowledges you made an error in judgment under extreme stress. The kind that shows remorse for violating protocols and endangering American interests. The kind that includes a request for administrative counseling instead of disciplinary action. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Sarah understood what was. Master Chief Jake Morrison sat in the sterile waiting area of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, his dress blue uniform feeling like a straitjacket as he watched congressional staffers hurry past with briefcases and tablets. The marble, floors, and imposing columns were designed to project authority and permanence, but to Morrison they felt like the walls of a tomb, a place where military careers came to die under the harsh lights of political theater. 3 days had passed since his secure phone call to Captain Cross from Bagram. 3 days since he'd learned that their simple act of saving children had exploded into a full-blown congressional investigation. Now he was about to testify before the House Armed Services Committee about what the media was calling the line in the sand incident. Master Chief Morrison, a young woman in a navy blue suit approached, her expression professionally neutral. I'm Sarah Chen, staff counsel for Congressman Bradley. The committee is ready for you. Morrison stood, his joints protesting after the 18-hour flight from Afghanistan. At 38, he was feeling every one of his 15 years in the teams, especially after the last 3 days of nonstop briefings, debriefings, and preparation sessions. The Navy had assigned him a JAG lawyer, but Morrison had declined representation. He'd tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may. The hearing room was smaller than he'd expected, but packed with more people than seemed physically possible. Representatives sat behind a curved dais, their faces ranging from curious to hostile. Behind them, cameras rolled and photographers clicked, capturing every moment for posterity and the evening news. In the gallery, Morrison spotted familiar faces, military officers, defense contractors, and journalists who specialized in Pentagon coverage. And in the back row, wearing a civilian suit that couldn't quite hide her military bearing, sat Captain Sarah Cross. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the crowded room. Morrison saw the same steel resolve that had carried her through that impossible morning in Afghanistan, but also something new. The weariness of someone who'd been fighting battles on multiple fronts for 72 hours straight. The committee will come to order, announced Congressman Robert Bradley, the committee chairman whose silver hair and commanding presence had dominated military hearings for nearly 2 decades. Today we're examining the events of August 8th in Afghanistan, specifically the unauthorized actions taken by Air Force Captain Sarah Cross and their implications for military discipline and rules of engagement. Morrison took his seat at the witness table, the microphone feeling like a weapon pointed at his chest. Behind him, he could sense the weight of expectations and agendas, the complex web of politics and policy that had transformed a simple rescue mission into a national controversy. "Master Chief Morrison," Congressman Bradley began, "you were present during the incident in question. Please describe for the committee what happened that morning." Morrison leaned forward, his voice steady despite the chaos in his head. "Sir, at approximately 0830 hours, my team observed a school bus surrounded by Taliban fighters. Intelligence indicated the presence of civilian casualties, children who were being used as human shields." "And what was your team's response?" "We requested immediate close air support from an A-10 Thunderbolt II, callsign Hawkeye 77, piloted by Captain Sarah Cross." Congressman Bradley consulted his notes. According to the official report, Captain Cross initially refused to engage the enemy forces. "Is that correct?" Morrison felt anger flare in his chest. The question was designed to make Sarah look like a coward, ignoring the impossible tactical situation she'd faced. "Sir, Captain Cross made a tactical assessment that conventional close air support would result in civilian casualties. Her assessment was correct. But she did eventually engage, in a highly unusual manner. Can you describe that engagement?" Morrison took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either vindicate Sarah or damn them both. "Sir, Captain Cross created a psychological barrier between the enemy forces and the civilians. She used her aircraft to establish a clear line of demarcation, then made it known that crossing that line would result in lethal force. She drew a line in the sand with agricultural lime," interrupted Congresswoman Patricia Holbrook, her Texas accent carrying a note of incredulity. "Using a $40 million attack aircraft as a crop duster. Do you consider that an appropriate use of military resources?" "Ma'am, I consider it brilliant." The words came out harsher than Morrison intended, but he didn't back down. "Captain, Cross faced an impossible tactical situation and found a solution that saved 14 innocent lives without causing unnecessary casualties. In my professional opinion, her actions were not only appropriate, but exemplary." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Morrison caught a glimpse of Sarah in the back row, her face carefully composed, but her eyes reflecting something that might have been gratitude. Congressman James Wheeler, a former Marine who'd lost his left arm in Iraq, leaned forward. "Master Chief, in your 15 years of military service, have you ever witnessed anything comparable to Captain Cross's actions?" "No, sir. What Captain Cross did was unprecedented." "And in your professional judgment, should it remain that way?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a burning aircraft. Morrison understood the trap, agree that Sarah's actions should remain unprecedented, and he'd be saying they were wrong. Disagree, and he'd be advocating for every pilot to ignore established protocols. "Sir, I believe that military personnel should be trained to think creatively and adapt to unusual circumstances. What Captain Cross did required exceptional judgment, tactical innovation, and moral courage. Those are qualities we should encourage in our military leaders." Congresswoman Holbrook shuffled her papers impatiently. "Master Chief, are you aware that Captain Cross's actions have created significant diplomatic complications? The Afghan government has filed a formal protest about unauthorized psychological warfare operations conducted without their knowledge." Morrison felt his jaw clench. "Ma'am, with respect, the Afghan government wasn't watching children being used as human shields. Captain Cross was." "That's not the point." "It is exactly the point." Morrison's voice echoed through the hearing room as his composure finally cracked. We're sitting here in air-conditioned comfort debating the diplomatic niceties of saving children's lives. 14 kids went home to their families because one pilot had the courage to think outside the box and do what was right instead of what was easy. The room fell silent. Morrison realized he'd just committed career suicide on live television, but he felt oddly liberated. Sometimes the truth demanded to be spoken, regardless of the consequences. Congressman Bradley banged his gavel. "Master, Chief, please confine your responses to answering the questions asked." "Sir, I am answering the questions. The question is whether we're going to punish excellence and innovation because it makes some people uncomfortable." A new voice cut through the tension. Congressman David Kim from California, whose son had been killed in Afghanistan 2 years earlier. "Master Chief Morrison, what would have happened if Captain Cross had followed standard protocols?" Morrison looked directly at the cameras, knowing that his words would be broadcast to millions of Americans. "Sir, 14 children would be dead. Their teacher would be dead. My team would have been forced to attempt a ground assault against overwhelming odds, likely resulting in American casualties as well. Captain Cross prevented a massacre. And yet," Congressman Bradley interjected, "she violated direct orders, ignored established protocols, and conducted unauthorized military operations. How do you reconcile that with military discipline?" Morrison had been dreading this question. But now that it was here, he found himself strangely calm. "Sir, military discipline exists to accomplish the mission and protect innocent life. Captain Cross accomplished both objectives. If that's not military discipline, then I don't understand what is." The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with representatives taking turns grilling Morrison about tactical procedures, rules of engagement, and the chain of command. Through it all, he maintained his defense of Sarah's actions, refusing to give ground despite increasingly hostile questions. During a brief recess, Morrison stepped into the hallway for air and found himself face to face with Captain Cross. She looked exhausted but determined, her civilian clothes unable to disguise the warrior beneath. "Jake," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time. "You didn't have to do that in there." "Yes, I did." Morrison glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Sarah, what you did saved those kids. I won't let these politicians turn you into a scapegoat for doing your job. It's going to cost you. You know that, right?" Morrison shrugged. "I've had a good run. 15 years in the teams, more deployments than I can count. If speaking the truth ends my career, then so be it." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Those children, they're safe because of what we did together. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. Don't let them convince you otherwise." A congressional staffer approached, indicating that the hearing was about to resume. As Morrison walked back into the chamber, he noticed a commotion in the gallery. New faces had appeared, older men in expensive suits who radiated the kind of quiet author. The Pentagon's basement levels existed in a twilight world of fluorescent lighting and endless corridors, where classified projects lived and died in windowless rooms marked only by alphanumeric codes. Captain Sarah Cross followed Deputy Director Collins through a maze of security checkpoints, each one requiring a higher level of clearance than the last. Beside her, Master Chief Morrison moved with the wary alertness of a predator sensing a trap. They'd been in Washington for a week now, attending briefings, debriefings, and informal consultations with officials whose business cards bore titles that revealed nothing about their actual function. Sarah's court-martial had been quietly dropped, replaced by a reassignment that felt more like house arrest. Morrison's return to Afghanistan had been indefinitely postponed, his expertise suddenly deemed too valuable to risk in the field. "This is it," Collins said, stopping before a door marked only with the number 47B. His keycard opened 3 separate locks in sequence, each one beeping softly as it disengaged. "Welcome to the Strategic Studies Group." The room beyond was part war room, part laboratory. Wall-mounted displays showed real-time satellite feeds from conflict zones around the world. Banks of computers hummed quietly, their screens filled with data streams and tactical analyses. And at the center of it all sat a conference table surrounded by the kind of people Sarah had learned to distrust. Men and women in expensive suits whose eyes held the cold calculation of those who treated war as an intellectual exercise. "Captain, cross Master Chief Morrison," Collins announced. "Meet the team that's going to revolutionize modern warfare." The introductions were a parade of advanced degrees and classified achievements. Dr. Margaret Chen, Cognitive Warfare Specialist. Colonel Richard Hayes, Behavioral Psychology Division. Dr. James Parker, Asymmetric Tactics Development. Each one studied Sarah and Morrison like specimens in a laboratory, their professional smiles hiding predatory interest. "Please, sit down," Collins gestured to two empty chairs at the table. "We have a great deal to discuss." Sarah remained standing, her instincts screaming warnings. "Before we discuss anything, I'd like to know exactly what this is about." Dr. Chen, a sharp-faced woman in her 50s, consulted a tablet before answering. "Captain, your actions in Afghanistan represent a breakthrough in psychological warfare that could transform military operations worldwide. We want to understand how you developed your technique and determine if it can be replicated." "My technique?" Sarah felt anger building in her chest. "You mean saving children's lives?" "We mean creating a psychological barrier through symbolic, territorial marking, then using the threat of overwhelming force to maintain psychological dominance over enemy combatants," Colonel Hayes interjected, his voice carrying the dry precision of an academic lecture. "Your innovation has applications far beyond the specific tactical situation in Afghanistan." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Collins. "Let me guess. You want to weaponize compassion." The room fell silent. Collins studied, Morrison with the calculating gaze of a chess master considering his next move. "Master Chief, we want to save lives. American lives, civilian lives, innocent lives. Captain Cross proved that psychological warfare can be more effective than kinetic operations in certain situations. We want to expand on that success." Dr. Parker, a thin man whose nervous energy suggested too much caffeine and not enough sleep, pulled up a presentation on the main display. "We've analyzed your engagement pattern, Captain. The agricultural lime created a visible psychological barrier, but the real innovation was your radio communications. You established rules of engagement that the enemy felt compelled to follow, essentially controlling their behavior through perceived authority." Sarah stared at the screen, which showed tactical diagrams of her flight pattern and transcripts of her radio calls. Seeing her spontaneous act of desperation reduced to charts and graphs made her feel sick. "You're missing the point," she said, quietly. "This wasn't about psychological dominance or behavioral control. It was about protecting children." "But the methodology is sound," Dr. Chen insisted. "We've run simulations based on your approach. Properly applied, these techniques could reduce civilian casualties by 40% while achieving tactical objectives with minimal American losses." Collins activated another display, showing satellite imagery of conflict zones in Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. "Captain, imagine if we could prevent massacres in these regions without deploying ground forces. Imagine if we could stop ethnic cleansing through psychological intervention rather than kinetic strikes." Despite herself, Sarah felt drawn to the images on the screen. Refugee camps, burning villages, children fleeing from violence that seemed endless and inevitable. The possibility that her actions could prevent such suffering was seductive, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the clinical approach these people were taking. "How exactly would this work?" Morrison asked, his tone carefully neutral. Dr. Parker's excitement was palpable as he launched into his explanation. "We establish psychological control zones using clearly marked boundaries, lines in the sand, as it were. We broadcast warnings in local languages, establish rules of engagement that favor civilian protection, and use the threat of precision strikes to enforce compliance. And if they don't comply, then we demonstrate the consequences, Colonel Hayes said matter-of-factly. Overwhelming force applied with surgical precision to reinforce the psychological framework. Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. You're talking about killing people to make a point. We're talking about killing a few people to save many people, Collins corrected. Captain, your method worked because the enemy believed you would follow through on your threats. That belief was based on demonstrated American military capability. We're simply systematizing that approach. The room's lights dimmed automatically as Dr. Chen activated a secure video feed. The screen showed a dusty African village with United Nations peacekeepers establishing a perimeter around a cluster of white tents. This is Somalia 3 days ago, Dr. Chen explained. Al-Shabaab militants are using civilians as human shields, preventing UN forces from accessing a refugee camp with critically needed medical supplies. Traditional military intervention would result in significant civilian casualties. The video switched to aerial footage showing armed men positioned among family compounds, their weapons trained on the UN perimeter. Sarah could see children playing in dusty courtyards, oblivious to the danger surrounding them. Using your methodology, Collins continued, we could establish a psychological control zone, issue ultimatums to the militants, and force their withdrawal, without a shot being fired. Or, Morrison said grimly, you could turn a humanitarian crisis into a massacre if your psychological warfare doesn't work. Every military operation involves risk, Colonel Hayes replied. The question is whether we're willing to let children die because we're afraid to take calculated risks to save them. Sarah felt the trap closing around her. They were using her own compassion against her, turning her desperate act to save 14 children into justification for a new form of warfare that could endanger thousands. But the images on the screen were real. Children who needed protection, families trapped by violence, innocent people caught in conflicts they didn't create. What do you want from us? She asked finally. Collins smiled for the first time since they'd entered the room. We want you to lead the development of this new doctrine. Captain Cross, your tactical innovation. Master Chief Morrison, your ground-level experience. Together, you could create a new approach to conflict resolution that saves lives instead of taking them. Dr. Parker activated another display, showing organizational charts and budget projections. The Psychological Intervention Task Force would be a joint military intelligence operation with field teams deployed to crisis zones worldwide. You'd have resources, authority, and the backing of the highest levels of government. Sarah studied the charts, her mind racing through the implications. Resources meant aircraft, personnel, and the ability to intervene in conflicts around the world. Authority meant the power to make life-and-death decisions without waiting for approval from distant bureaucrats, but it also meant becoming part of a system that would inevitably corrupt her original intentions. And if we refuse? Morrison asked. Collins's smile disappeared. Master Chief, you're a valuable asset with 15 years of classified experience. Captain Cross possesses tactical innovations that could revolutionize military operations. The United States government has significant investments in both of your careers. The threat was delivered with bureaucratic politeness, but its meaning was clear. Refuse to cooperate and face the consequences. Sarah realized that her line in the sand had made her a prisoner of her own success. I need time to think, she said. Of course, Collins replied. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, we begin field testing with or without your cooperation. As they left the conference room, Sarah's mind was spinning with conflicting emotions. The possibility of preventing atrocities around the world was intoxicating, but the clinical approach these people were taking felt like a betrayal of everything she'd stood for in that Afghan valley. Morrison was silent until they reached the parking garage, then grabbed Sarah's arm. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial stretched before Sarah Cross, like a black wound in the earth, its polished granite surface reflecting the faces of the few visitors who came to pay their respects at midnight. Sarah approached the wall alone, her footsteps echoing off the walkway as she searched for whoever had summoned her to this place of remembrance and loss. The voice came from the shadows near the three servicemen statue. A figure emerged, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that held the weight of decades in government service. She wore a simple black coat and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to wielding power from behind the scenes. "I'm Catherine Walsh," the woman said, extending her hand. "Former Deputy Director of the CIA, current advisor to the Senate Intelligence Committee. We need to talk about what you've gotten yourself into." Sarah shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and steady gaze. "How do I know you're who you say you are?" Walsh smiled, an expression that held more sadness than humor. "Captain, if I wanted to hurt you, we wouldn't be having this conversation at a public memorial. I'm here because someone needs to tell you the truth about what Collins and his people are really planning." They walked slowly along the memorial wall, the names of the dead scrolling past like a litany of sacrifice and loss. Walsh waited until they were well away from any potential surveillance devices before continuing. "The Strategic Studies Group isn't developing your psychological warfare techniques to save lives, Captain. They're creating a new form of imperialism, one that looks humanitarian on the surface but serves to extend American influence into regions we can't control through conventional means." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "You're saying they're lying about preventing massacres?" "I'm saying they'll prevent some massacres while enabling others, depending on which serves American strategic interests." Walsh stopped before a section of the wall where flowers had been left at the base. "Captain, do you know what the Phoenix program was?" The name triggered a memory from Sarah's military history classes. "Vietnam, CIA assassination program that targeted Viet Cong infrastructure, among other things. The Phoenix program was sold as a way to win hearts and minds, to protect villages from communist infiltration. In practice, it became a tool for eliminating anyone who opposed American-backed government policies." Walsh's voice carried the weight of personal experience. "I was a young analyst then, fresh out of graduate school, convinced that we were serving the cause of freedom. It took me years to understand that we were simply creating more sophisticated ways to control people." Sarah stared at the wall, seeing her own reflection superimposed over the names of the dead. "What does this have to do with my situation? Your psychological warfare techniques are the Phoenix program for the 21st century. Collins and his team will use them to establish American-controlled safe zones in strategic regions, eliminate opposition leaders who refuse to cooperate, and maintain plausible deniability when things go wrong." Walsh turned to face Sarah directly. "Captain, they're going to use your compassion to justify a new form of colonialism." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Everything she'd feared about the Strategic Studies Group was true. They were planning to weaponize her desperate act of love into a tool of oppression. "Then I'll refuse to cooperate," Sarah said. "I'll expose what they're planning." Walsh shook her head. "Captain, you're not thinking like an intelligence officer. They don't need your cooperation anymore. They have your methods. What they need is your legitimacy, your moral authority as the hero who saved 14 children. With or without your active participation, they'll use your name and your story to justify whatever they choose to do." Sarah felt the trap closing around her completely. "Then what options do I have?" "One option. Disappear." The word hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Sarah understood what Walsh was offering, a chance to walk away from her military career, her identity, everything she'd built over 12 years of service. "You're talking about defection." "I'm talking about survival." and about preventing your innovation from being used to cause the very kind of suffering you tried to prevent. Walsh reached into her coat and withdrew a manila envelope. New identity. Documents. Canadian passport. Enough money to start over. There's a fishing boat leaving Norfolk at dawn. The captain is a friend who asks no questions. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were documents that would transform Captain Sarah Cross into Rebecca Morgan, a Canadian citizen with a clean background and no military history. There was also a thick stack of cash and what looked like contact information for a safe house in Nova Scotia. "Why are you helping me?" Walsh was quiet for a long moment, staring at the memorial wall where so many names reflected the cost of good intentions corrupted by political expediency. "Because 30 years ago, I helped create programs that turned young soldiers into killers in the name of peace. Because I spent decades watching idealistic officers become willing participants in systems that destroyed the very values they thought they were protecting." She turned to Sarah with eyes that held a lifetime of regret. "Because maybe, just this once, I can help someone escape before the system destroys their soul." A sound from behind them made both women turn. Master Chief Morrison emerged from the shadows, his expression grim but unsurprised. "Jake?" Sarah felt a surge of relief, mixed with concern. "How did you find you?" "I followed you from the hotel." Morrison approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. "Ms. Walsh, I presume? Your reputation precedes you." Walsh studied Morrison carefully. "Master Chief, I wasn't expecting you." "I wasn't expecting to be here either. But Sarah's not disappearing without me." Morrison moved to stand beside Sarah, his presence radiating the same protective energy she'd felt in Afghanistan. "We're in this together." "Master Chief, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with," Walsh warned. "Collins isn't just developing new military doctrine, he's building a shadow organization with unlimited resources and no oversight. Cross his plans and you'll face accidents, scandals, or simply disappear into the federal prison system on classified charges." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I've been fighting the system for 15 years. I'm not about to start running now." "This isn't about running," Sarah said quietly. "It's about preventing something terrible from being done in our names." She looked down at the documents in her hands. A new life, a clean start. Freedom from the moral compromises that were being forced upon her. But she also thought about the 14 children in Afghanistan, about the little girl who had pressed her face against the bus window, about the translator who had sent her a letter thanking her for saving his daughter. "There has to be another way," Sarah said. "Something that stops Collins without requiring us to abandon everything we've sworn to protect." Walsh shook her head. "Captain, you're still thinking like a military officer. You believe in chains of command, official channels, the system correcting itself, but the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It turns good people into instruments of policy, regardless of the human cost." Morrison was studying the memorial wall, his eyes tracing the endless list of names. "Ms. Walsh, what if we went public, exposed the Strategic Studies Group's real agenda?" "With what evidence? Everything they've shown you is classified. Any attempt to reveal their plans would result in espionage charges that would put you in federal prison for the rest of your lives?" Walsh's voice carried the finality of someone who'd seen such attempts before. "The only way to win this game is not to play it." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to find clarity in the chaos of conflicting loyalties and impossible choices. She thought about the A-10 circling over that Afghan valley, about the weight of the controls as she'd drawn that crucial line in the sand. In that moment, the choice had been simple: save the children or watch them die. Now, every option seemed to require sacrificing something precious. "What happens to the next group of children who need saving?" Sarah asked quietly. If we disappear, if we refuse to develop better ways to protect innocent people, how many lives could we have saved? Walsh's expression softened slightly. Captain, that's the trap they've set for you. They'll always be able to point to some crisis, some group of innocents who need protection, some greater good that justifies whatever they want to do. But the price of that protection is your complicity in a system that creates more crises than it solves. A new voice cut through the conversation, professional and coldly amused. Ms. Walsh, I see you're still trying to save idealistic young officers from their own patriotism. Sarah spun around to see Deputy Director Collins approaching with 4 men in dark suits, their movements coordinated with the precision of a tactical team. In the shadows beyond, she could see additional figures taking positions around the memorial. Director Collins, Walsh replied calmly. Still turning heroes into war criminals, I see. Collins smiled, but his eyes remained cold. Captain, Master Chief Morrison, I'm disappointed. Did you really think we wouldn't monitor your movements? This meeting was observed from the moment you arrived. Morrison shifted subtly, his body language preparing for violence, but Collins raised a hand in a gesture of mock reassurance. Please, Master Chief.